Welcome everyone to the Children's Policy Centre webinar series, In Conversation with Children's Commissioners. This is the first of our conversations in 2024, and we have more coming over the rest of the year, so keep an eye on our website. I'm Sharon Bessell. I'm a Professor of Public Policy at the Crawford School of Public Policy at the Australian National University and Director of the Children's Policy Centre. I'm joining from the beautiful and unceded lands of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people. In the work that we do here at the Children's Policy Centre, we aim to engage genuinely and respectfully with the traditional owners of the lands on which we work, recognising the importance of connection to community and to country for all children and young people, but especially for First Nations children and young people. Today, I pay my respects to Elders past and present, and to those who never reached Elder status, and to emerging leaders. The Children's Policy Centre is based at the Australian National University, and we have three objectives. First, to undertake innovative interdisciplinary research on a range of issues relating to children's policy. Second, to seek to connect researchers, policymakers and practitioners on a range of issues to promote the human rights, wellbeing and best interests of children and young people. And third, we aim to communicate research findings to contribute to better outcomes for children and young people. And how exciting it is to be back with our Conversations with Children's Commissioners webinar series. Today, we're joined by Liana Buchanan. Liana has been Victoria's Principal Commissioner for Children and Young People since 2016 and is also a part-time Commissioner of the Victorian Law Reform Commission. Liana joined us in 2021. It feels like it was about 6 months ago, but it was 3 years ago that Liana joined us on this series to talk about the work that the Commission was then undertaking around out-of-home care, youth justice and youth detention. And today we're again talking about out-of-home care and children's and young people's experiences of school and education when they're in care. Liana, it's so great to have you back with us. Welcome. And today we're delighted to be joined by two members of the Commission's Youth Council. Amelia Hunt has been a member of the Youth Council since 2020. Amelia grew up in public housing in Bendigo and was in kinship care at the age of 16. She is one of the 2024 ABC Haywire winners, which is such an amazing achievement. There are some incredible things produced through Haywire. In addition to her role with the Youth Council, Amelia is also a project officer at the Commission for Children and Young People, and Amelia is in her final year of a double degree of a Bachelor of Laws and a Bachelor of Global Studies, and she's passionate about advocating for the human rights and for the environment. Amelia, it's so great to have you with us today.
Thank you.
And welcome to Ruby Sait. Ruby has been a member of the Youth Council since the beginning of this year. Ruby has lived in residential care, in foster care and in kinship care, and she has a passion for advocacy, which is evident in her work with the Youth Parliament, the Create Foundation and the Centre for Excellence in Child and Family Welfare. Ruby is in her third and final year studying communications and majoring in journalism. Ruby believes that all children and young people should have a say in the things that impact them, and she's passionate about playing a role in helping to make that happen. Ruby, it's great to have you with us. Thanks for joining us.
Happy to be here.
So we're going to begin today with a short presentation to set the scene, and then we're going to move into conversation. I have some questions for Liana, for Amelia and Ruby, but we also have time for questions from those joining us. So if you do have any questions, please pop them into the Q&A. Liana and Amelia, I think the two of you are going to do the presentation. So I'm going to hand over to you now to set the scene for the conversation.
Thanks so much, Sharon. It's fantastic to be here, everybody. From our part, we're joining from Wurundjeri land, and on behalf of the three of us, I'd like to pay my respects to Elders past and present, to any First Nations people who've joined us, and to acknowledge that we're on land that was never ceded and always was, always will be Aboriginal land. Now, this, as you all know, if you're accustomed to this webinar series, is all about conversation. But we were keen, given that we're going to be talking about our most recent inquiry, we were keen to share with you some of the headlines. So we've taken what is usually a very substantial set of slides and crunched them down just to condense what this report involves into a few short slides, genuinely a few, so bear with us. I'll hand over to Amelia to kick us off.
Thanks, Liana. So moving into how we did the inquiry, I think it's worth noting it was tabled in November 2023. And also something that's pretty cool is that the Youth Council here at the Commission was involved from literally start to finish, which I think is really special. So information sources throughout the inquiry, we did 101 consultations with children and young people across the placement types, and then also surveyed 88 children and young people online as well, and conducted 350 stakeholder interviews with carers, community service workers, education professionals, and ACCOs as well. And we also took submissions from individuals and organisations, so young people and people like academics and organisations, all sorts, which is really cool too. And then looked at data from the Department of Education and the Department of Families, Fairness and Housing as well. In terms of what we found for measuring educational engagement of children and young people in care, we found that 64% of secondary students in care and 48% of primary students were chronically absent, and only 25% of students in care progressed from year 10 to year 12, compared to 82% in the general student population. Students in care were also 25 percentage points less likely to participate in that plan, and those who did received substantially lower results than the general student population. Students in care were also 5 times more likely to be suspended than the general population, and also 5 times more likely to be expelled than the general population, and 7 times more likely to be subject to incidents of restraint or seclusion as well. We also found that the practice of informal suspensions and soft expulsions was very common, but because they're not authorised, there's actually no data on their frequency as well. And it's worth noting too that 12% of students in care were on modified timetables.
So again, we are condensing and hitting just the very summary points, a very big inquiry. When we spoke to those children and young people and the hundreds of other stakeholders for this, of course there was a lot about the care system that contributed to the outcomes that Amelia's just described, and a lot about the education system. So really, in a nutshell, the issues in the care system largely come down to a system that is incredibly pressured, that is generally crisis-driven. There's incredible instability, both for children and young people in terms of placements and in terms of staffing and workforce. And what we heard from everyone is that all of these aspects of the care system mean that there's significant barriers for children and young people to engage with school or stay engaged with school. And also for those working in the system, it's pretty hard for them to keep education as a priority when they're so crisis-driven and focused on just trying to find a placement or hopefully keep a child or young person safe. So the 3 issues that are on this slide reflect 3 of those aspects of our pressured care system that we heard really make a difference. We looked at all of these: placement instability, levels of support for carers, workforce turnover and staff turnover in the system. And we found that all of these measures have got worse in the last 5 years since we at the Commission looked at them for another inquiry. So what you see on those slides gives you a bit of a flavour about what children and young people told us. They want to try and stay in school. They need a key, consistent worker who they trust, who they can share what they want, who can advocate for them in care team meetings and try and enable them to stay at the school they want or get some kind of better outcome. But actually what most of them still find is that there's such a level of turnover that often they don't even know who their worker is, or if they do, then there's such turnover that they don't have any sense that there's any safe person to go to or to barrack for them. In terms of placement instability, that quote is just one example of so many that we had. Moving around from house to house, being in an unstable condition increased my anxiety, made it hard to meet new people and go to new places like I have to do at school. We also had lots and lots of accounts of children and young people having to move schools, some arguing really hard, and Ruby, you might have something to say on this later, some having to argue really hard to stay at a school, or to be transported long distances to stay at a school. So the fact that placement instability in Victoria's out-of-home care system continues to get worse, not better, is a real problem for lots of reasons, including education engagement. And then finally on this slide, support for carers, we heard from a lot of people, both children, young people and carers and other workers, that the lack of support for carers is a real problem. That's both in financial terms. So we in Victoria have the lowest care allowance in the country. It hasn't been increased since 2016. And what we heard from lots of children and young people is that that meant that they didn't have access to the excursions, some of the equipment, some of the uniforms that other children and young people had. But we also heard a lot about the absence of supports for carers in terms of people they could go to get advice about how to engage with school, how to advocate for the children in their care. So that issue around support for carers was a really big one. Then last substantive slide, some of the key issues that we heard about in terms of schools, I would summarise this way. We heard that schools are not consistently equipped to understand trauma and the impact that trauma has on children's development and children's behaviour. And we heard that from children and young people, like the ones whose quotes are here. Our brains are wired different because of what we've been through and how the trauma has impacted us. We need more support and encouragement, less rigid regulations, says one child and young person. Another young person who had left care said all teachers should have trauma training. We should have alternatives to excluding students, suspensions, expulsions, have a support worker at school at all times. That needs to be mandatory, who kids can speak to any time. Teachers, be more human, please, not on autopilot. We just had, we saw some great examples of schools that had had school leadership with an eye to responding to trauma, understanding children's needs and dealing with behaviours better, and had trained the whole of the school staff and so on. But that was by far and away not the norm, and it's not set as a system expectation or requirement, which we've recommended needs to happen. The other issue that we heard about schools is that many, many people working in schools, teaching staff and other staff, just don't understand the care system. And when you get to know the care system even a little bit, the complexity, the challenges, the pressures for children in that system are so enormous, but people, children and young people felt like the adults in their schools just did not understand those pressures. Then we also finally had a lot about bullying, stigma associated being with a student in care, and negative attitudes. Now, a lot of that was bullying and stigma from other children and young people in the school, but not only, we had quite a lot from children and young people about negative attitudes from staff. Some of that manifested as very low expectations, an assumption that if you're a student in care, you're not going to do very well. Others, like the quote here, manifested in, frankly, just incredibly offensive ways. So Quinn, who was 17 when they spoke to us, and in Resi said, a few of the teachers haven't been good. They make insulting comments about my personal life, about living in out-of-home care. At some point last year, we shared in class what we did on our weekends, and I spoke about having ice cream. And the teacher responded with, is that what our taxpayer money pays for? So we had some pretty awful experiences from children and young people in care, which cumulatively led to them not feeling like they could continue to go to school, or in many cases, like the stats that Amelia just shared tell us, in many, many cases, children's behaviours in school were responded to in punitive terms and resulted in them being suspended or expelled. Last point I'll make, the data that on expulsions that Amelia shared, 5 times more likely if you're a student in care to be expelled than any other kind of student. That's not just kids in secondary school that we're talking about. So when we looked at it, we found that 3% of foundation prep students in care were suspended and 4% of students in grade 1. So we're talking about pretty punitive responses even to very small children. I think the last slide just tells us where you can go if you want to dive into the rest of this beauty. But hopefully that will give you a bit of an idea about what we looked at and what we found, and set the scene a bit for the conversation to come.
Thank you so much for that. That's incredibly helpful in setting the scene. It's such incredibly powerful work. Sometimes there are quotes that feel like a shard of glass to the heart. The ice cream quote's one of those. I think it's painful to hear. So to experience that is so much worse. I did just want to remind people that we will be recording this session, and the recording will be available on the Children's Policy Centre website afterwards. But let's go to conversation. And for those who are joining us, if you have questions, please do pop them in the Q&A. You've given us such a powerful overview of the challenges that the Let Us Learn report sets out, and that we know face children and young people who are in out-of-home care in terms of getting to school, staying in school and learning. And I think we should, as a society, be ashamed that children and young people are still facing those challenges. But I wanted to begin maybe a little bit more positively. And there were some quotes in the report that really highlight the positive difference that caring teachers and school staff can make. Amelia, I wonder if we could start by talking just a little bit about what you heard about what makes a positive difference at school. What you heard during the inquiry, you might like to share your own experiences about how we can start to shift the dial to be more human, as that quote said.
Yeah, of course. So you're right, we heard so much positive stuff as well as negative throughout the inquiry. And I think both in personal experience, but also upon reflection of what we've heard, a lot of the time it was simple things like having, teachers or even just a staff member. Like I think from memory, there was one young person who had a support person that was one of the maintenance people at the school. And like it was just a positive bond and relationship, and that supported that young child to go to school and feel comfortable at school. And so I think overwhelmingly I think relationships and those genuine connections was a massive positive. To keeping kids engaged and stuff like that, and favorite activities and subjects and stuff like that as well, of course.
Amelia, we've been doing research over the last couple of years with children who are growing up in contexts of poverty. And again and again and again, we hear about the power of positive relationships. I think we should never underestimate just how important those relationships are. Ruby, if you were to give advice to adults who lead schools or work in schools about what they need to do to support children and young people who are in out-of-home care, what advice would you give about what we need to do?
Probably just be patient and listen to the young person. I feel like that's one of the biggest things. And I've been to 10 schools in my whole entire life. And the one thing is that until I went into VCAL, I felt like I wasn't being heard. I actually became homeless when I was at VCAL, and my VCAL teacher went through a real estate agent and helped me get a place. So it's those connections. It's that amazing going above and beyond, because while yes, young people in out-of-home care are experiencing difficulties, it doesn't mean that people can't be like, hey, I'm going to go above and beyond for this young person because they deserve it. Being able to thrive and being in an environment to allow us to thrive is what's going to make such a difference in a young person's life.
Thanks, Ruby. That's, such powerful advice, I think. The report also talks about, and your presentation made painfully clear, the problems of negative attitudes and low expectations that really harm children and young people. And I wondered if we could just pick up on that issue for a little bit more. Ruby, would you like to talk us through how those things play out and how we can start to shift them, those negative attitudes, those low expectations?
Yeah, I think it's one of those things where you need to be able to understand that every young person's experience is different. It's not just, you don't just fit into a box. And like these are even like for the case of young people that aren't in care, everyone is going through different things and you never know what is going on underneath the surface. So being patient and going straight to the young person and be like, hey, what can we do to help you? What do you need? Like one of the things that I can say is that mainstream school wasn't for me. The environment it was a toxic environment for me, and having such a uncertainty on what life could look like, it wasn't allowing me to be the best person I could be. So going to the young person being like, hey, alternative education, is that what you need? What can we do so that you can actually finish school? Because here's the thing, such a low percentage of young people with a care experience actually go on to study at university. Like I feel like Amelia and I can say like we're two young people that are going to be graduating in a couple of months, and honestly, for a time, I never thought that was impossible. So being able to help young people and also set those goals and be like, hey, where do you want to be in life? Like, what do you want to achieve? It's not like, oh, you've had this experience, this is what you're not going to achieve anything in life. It's like, set those goals. Sit down with a young person and be like, hey, what can I do to help you? And sometimes you're going to have to go above and beyond, because at the end of the day, if you're working as a teacher, if you're working as just a worker in the system, you need to go above and beyond, because we're not just your work. We're people that need help. And for a lot of young people, they might not have those connections with family members or parents, so that they don't have those people cheering them on. And sometimes that's all they need.
I reckon there's also something about making sure that if you're an adult in the system, you're not giving messages to the young person that their education doesn't matter. From what we've talked about, yes, there have been times that you've had exactly that message. Yeah, so when I was 17 years old, I left out of home care and was given a chance to get a rental history, which didn't work out, which led me to be homeless. So I ended up moving into a hotel for the month. And I had 2 DHS workers come into my hotel room one day being like, if you don't find a place within a week, we're going to send you into Sait to another residential care home. And I was like, I just enrolled back in school because I had dropped out of mainstream school because it just wasn't working for me. I was getting bullied for being in care and I was struggling with the education just in general. So they told me that when I said, I just enrolled in VCAL, I'm going to go back to school and I'm going to graduate. And they're like, well, you dropped out of mainstream school, so your education does not matter. And hearing those words, that's actually stuck with me. And it's what, I'm 22 now. It has stuck with me all that time. And I'm like, well, no, it does matter. I graduated VCAL. I am at university. I'm about to graduate with a Bachelor of Communications majoring in journalism. And it is honestly something that I'm disgusted to have said I've experienced, because that it made me feel like I was never going to succeed. I was never going to get to where I was going to be. And like, I think one thing is like, yes, like if you are going to work with young people in care, you need to nurture them. You need to make sure they have an environment to thrive, because that one sentence almost made me doubt myself. It made me question my capacity and what I was able to do. And I don't think any young person deserves that. And if it wasn't for my VCAL teacher who gave me a chance, I probably would have gone into State, because I didn't have really anyone supporting me. So I'm very thankful that I went to VCAL, and I had to work twice as hard to get into university, because VCAL obviously isn't the normal way that people go into university. It was the best thing I could do for my social, my academic, and just everything.
Ruby, there is nothing more powerful, I think, than proving someone wrong when they've said something that hurtful to you, and you know that power was with you. But young people should not have to work that hard, should not have to prove themselves. Amelia, we've been hearing about some of the stories that are told about young people and children who are in care, and stories are powerful. Narrative Narratives shape how we understand issues. What kind of stories would you like to be told about children and young people who are in out-of-home care?
That is such a good question. I love it. But yeah, so I would say it's something that came up a lot as well throughout the inquiry and kind of drafting recs and stuff. Like the Youth Council was involved with drafting recommendations, and we were talking about, you know, how do we try and address like reducing the stigma in the school environment and just in the community in general. And I think a lot of the time, and like even on reflection of my own experience at school, I think awareness of the care system is quite limited. Like I didn't know about out-of-home care until I was in the system itself and stuff. And I think it could start with being as simple as, you know, having discussions in the classroom in primary school about, you know, different living arrangements. And because there's even people that aren't in formal care placements that might live with their grandparents or family friends and stuff like that. And there's also stigma that impacts them too. So little things like having positive conversations around different family dynamics and situations, but also I guess remembering that like especially children and young people can't control the situations that they live in. And so like, you know, bullying and stigma around that sort of stuff is completely uncalled for. And like, I mean, it's uncalled for in any sense, but especially for things that they can't control themselves. So yeah, I just think positive conversations around living arrangements and yeah, just trying to embrace difference as well, because that's really the core of it, right? Yeah.
It's great, thank you. Liana, Amelia and Ruby have shared really powerfully about what a difference individuals can make, what a difference those different stories and conversations can make. But there is a bigger problem. There's a problem, a deep problem with our systems, and that was clear in the presentation. This is a big question, but where do we start making the changes so that children who are in out-of-home care can have their right to education met? And particularly, I'd love to hear your reflections on what needs to happen around responding to trauma, which is necessarily part of the experience of being in care.
I might start there, because one of the most important recommendations from my point of view, and I'm nodding to the sides, Amelia at least knows what I'm about to say, is the recommendation that I mentioned fleetingly. We think that it's an absolute no-brainer that every school and all the people in it must have some understanding about trauma and the way trauma impacts children, child development, brain development, behaviour, and ways to appropriately respond to that. Now, that's important for the children and young people in care, but we've had the Australian Childhood Maltreatment Study that tells us that well over 60% of children have experienced at least one form of childhood maltreatment. So actually, it's more common than not amongst our school students that they will be carrying some form of trauma. So equipping teachers, equipping staff in schools, making sure that schools have the right wellbeing supports as well as the right kind of training and responses, so that when trauma impacts children, it is understood and it is not punished. That to me is a no-brainer. Now, there are some mechanisms in Victoria for schools to get some of that training. They've got a mental health fund that they can tap into and get trauma-informed training. It's entirely at the discretion of the school and the school leader. What I'm pushing the government to do is set a requirement across all schools that they have that trauma-informed approach. At the care system, again, you're right, Sharon, they're big questions and I could spend a long time answering them. In the care system, there's some fundamentals that we need to tackle. We need placement stability for children and young people. We need therapeutic supports for all children coming into care. If you come into care, by definition, you've experienced some form of trauma or harm, and then the prospect of being removed from family, whatever is in place in that family, is itself traumatic. So the fact that we do not have therapeutic responses for all children and young people in care is very bizarre. The other kind of one thing that I will mention is agency. So across this inquiry, across our In Our Own Words inquiry from 2019, every single one of the hundreds of inquiries that we've completed whilst I've been here, what children and young people tell us is that they don't have a say, they don't have a voice. Often they're not even told reasons, given explanations for the decisions that are made about them. And that is such an issue for children and young people in care. And so that concept of agency in care then translates to all aspects of a child or a young person's life. If you don't have a say in what's going on, it's pretty hard to get by, let alone thrive and do well at school or anywhere else.
And I think that lack of agency, not being able to have a say on your own life, on the things that matter for you, is re-traumatizing. You know, it deepens that experience. Amy and Ruby, I can see that you're both nodding when Liana talks about the importance of having a say. Would either of you like to come in on that and talk about, you know, how things shift when young people and children, and I think it's important that we say young people and children because it's all ages, you know, when young people and children do have a say.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I realized, and one thing that I experienced that was really powerful was when I went back to mainstream school when I was in residential care, and I finished my first day of school in year 10. It was great. Came home, Ruby, you are moving to a different town, to a different residential care home. And I was shocked, and I was like, why? I had just gone into mainstream school. You wanted me to go back into mainstream school, and yet you're telling me I need to change schools again. So I said no. So no, that's not happening. Oh yeah, cool, I'll move, but I'm not changing schools. I've got friends, I've got an environment that at the time was a good environment, and I don't want to uplift my life again because I've had that. And being in care, we get taken out of our family or parents or whatever situation that we're living in to be put into care. And you would think that we would be put into an environment where it's more sustainable, more encouraging, more nurturing, but it's almost going backwards in a sense. And it's just reopening those old wounds, making it difficult to understand, even a simple thing is unpacking your bags and actually moving into that home. So I think it's one of those things where being able to have children, young people having a voice and being able to say, no, this is what I want. One of the probably biggest achievements I did for myself when it came to what the decision making of my life was, I want to come to my own care team meetings. I want that. If you're going to be doing having a meeting to decide what my life is going to look like, I want to be there. And so I started going, and I was like, I want to do this. I want to be this is what I want to do. And I started learning what my voice was, and I started learning how to use my voice. And God, I feel like some of my workers were like, oh my God, Ruby is very passionate, because I was like, no, I am going to live my life the way I want to, and there are things that I need. And I think that's one of the most powerful things. And every child, every young person should have that right and should be able to be like, no, it's my life. It doesn't matter if you're under the age of 18, it doesn't matter if you're under the age of 12, it's their life. And it's up to them, because depending on what they decide and how their life is shaped, it dictates their future. And if they're not given that chance, how can they thrive? Thrive, and it's definitely my word. And thriving is just, I live by the quote, thriving, not just surviving, because for so long I feel like out of home care young people are just surviving, but we need to thrive because we want to succeed, and we deserve to.
Ruby, that's so powerful, and yes, you deserve to. You have a right to. Amelia, was there anything that you wanted to add to that around having a say?
I think it's honestly Ruby's experience, I can definitely relate to elements of it. And also we've heard countless times, and not even just care team meetings, there's so many meetings that happen at schools or wherever it is, and the children, young people sometimes they are involved in a meaningful way, but then there's also being excluded entirely, and then there's being there but not being given the space to meaningfully participate. And that's also really important. Because yeah, even a very quick example is we were excluded from our care team meetings, and I was 16. And then eventually we were able to go, because we'd like push with our youth worker or something. And casually in one of the meetings, the child protection workers had said that we'd been in care for 2 weeks, my sister and I. And I was like, hold up, no, like we were in care for 6 months. And so like, imagine if we hadn't been in that room and hadn't felt comfortable to say that, like their records would have never been corrected because the system said 2 weeks. And then like, they were really great. And we sat for like an hour and explained the whole timeline, which again is also kind of re-traumatizing in a way because you have to relive everything again. But little things like that have a massive impact. So I think creating that meaningful and safe space in those meetings for children and young people to participate in a way that works for them as well. Like you can't just go, oh, hey, Amelia, you're here, like speak now. That's not gonna work. Like some people like to write things down or have someone else say things for them and stuff like that. It depends on the individual, but yeah, that's a little piece.
An early scholar of childhood studies, Roger Hart, used to say that one of the problems is that the problem is not listening to children, but it's also listening to children with adult ears. And I think that's so powerful. You know, being in the room and being told to speak is not being respectfully engaged with or listened to.
Exactly. Yeah.
We've got a few questions in the chat, and I will just turn to them now. Liana, there's a question. Is there any data on queer or gender diverse children and on the harms that impact these children? What is the school's duty of care here? Was that something that came through in the research?
Yeah, it was. The data didn't because until very, very recently, there hasn't been good or consistent collection of data on gender identity or sexuality, or even the capacity to record appropriate pronouns in some of the child protection systems. We made recommendations about that for some years, which have recently been acted on. So the data wasn't available, but in amongst the children and young people we spoke to, we heard quite a lot from queer and gender diverse young people who talked about the combined experiences of being bullied because they were in out-of-home care and bullied or experiencing stigma and negative behaviour from peers because of their gender identity or their sexuality. So yes, is the short answer. We had a lot about that. I won't go off track too much. We also had a huge amount from Aboriginal children and young people who talked about racism that they experienced, and certainly overrepresentation of Aboriginal children and young people in the care system is a problem everywhere. It's especially bad here in Victoria. And so we had a lot about homophobia, transphobia, about the types of behaviours that just compound to make a student's experience at school even worse. And for some of the students, some of the young people who spoke to it meant that they disengaged from school. They, you know, what we heard from so many children and young people is actually they wanted school to be a good place. They wanted, for some, it was a safe place or as safe and stable as they got. And for those for whom that wasn't the case, they wanted to do well at school. They wanted it to provide that safety, that stability. They wanted at school to be like all other children and young people when they know that that wasn't their experience out of school. But when they went and experienced bullying and discrimination, and then when that was cumulative, you know, with other forms of discrimination, that was an added barrier for them, and some of them didn't engage. Just said, no, it's too hard. It's not my safe place.
Liana, you also mentioned how difficult the system is and how much racism there is for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children and young people. I wonder if you just wanted to talk through the recommendations that you've made around that. And I'm also, sorry, a two-part question, which is always tricky, but I'm also wondering whether you heard from Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children and young people whether having a Torres Strait Islander or an Aboriginal person in the school that they could go to made a difference?
Yep. I'll start with that and then come back to my recommendations. The short answer is yes, that helped. And in Victoria, and I assume there's equivalent positions in other jurisdictions, there are Koori education support officers in government schools. And for some children and young people, that had been a really positive thing. They knew who that person was. They'd been a source of support. They'd been, you know, a really good advocate within the school setting. But what we know from this inquiry and others is that those positions are really stretched. They're required to provide advice and support and guidance to school staff, and often then required to provide individual support to students and carers or families. And actually that's very, very hard to achieve. The other thing that we've heard a lot about is those positions often don't have a lot of power in a school setting. So if it is about trying to escalate issues and get school leadership to kind of take a different tack, that's not consistently answered. So yes, that's an important part, but in previous inquiries, we've made recommendations that those positions, those Aboriginal identified positions in schools, the KESOs, they need to be strengthened so that those roles both have more capacity to do what they need to do, but also have more power. We recommended in this inquiry a number of things. We recommended that the avenues by which students can complain about racism, including through to schools directly, but also through a report racism hotline, we recommended that that should be reviewed, and that the outcomes of that review should be made public and its recommendations clearly acted on. Because what we had a lot from students is that even if they spoke up and raised something about the horrendous racism they'd experienced, nothing was done. We also made recommendations around cultural understanding training, not only continuing to be rolled out with anti-racism training for staff, but also rolled out in a different version for peers in among students. So we've made a number of recommendations to try and tackle that experience of racism that we heard so much in this inquiry. And I've got to say that we hear in other contact with children and young people. Meena Singh, the Commissioner for Aboriginal Children here, she engages with Aboriginal students right across the state. It is the single issue that she comes back and says has been raised with her. It's a big issue.
Thanks, Liana. There's also a question in the chat that asks what the response has been to the Victorian 11th standard, Standard 1. And forgive me, I'm not quite sure of the details of that, but is that something that you would like to comment on?
Yeah, certainly. Glad you know about it, wherever you're from. In Victoria, we have had, I think we were possibly the first jurisdiction to have legislated mandatory child safe standards that applies to schools, but a huge range of different organisations that work with children. These predated the Royal Commission, and then a couple of years ago, post-Royal Commission, the Victorian government aligned our standards so that they largely reflect the national principles for child safe organisations, with one major exception. In Victoria, we have an additional standard, which is our first standard, which is the one I imagine that is being referred to here, which is a requirement that organisations must act and put strategies in place to make sure there is cultural safety for Aboriginal children. So that's seen as a core element of creating a child-safe organisation. That is, as I say, only been in law for the past, well, probably 2 years now. And we've been doing some work, as have other organisations, to try and support implementation of that. I probably can't comment on how far schools have gone down the path in implementing that, but certainly we see it as an important part of the efforts that are needed by schools and other organisations to try and make sure that the racism is not tolerated, that it's tackled very directly, and that more broadly actions taken to make sure that Aboriginal children are in culturally safe environments.
There are another couple of questions in the Q&A that we'll come back to in a moment. But I wanted to go back to the issue that you raised earlier, which was around the support for carers and trying to make sure that carers are supported to be able to support children and young people, and to stop this really awful issue of the churn, of the constant movement that children and young people in care so often experience. Before we kind of talk about how carers can be better supported, Ruby and Amelia, I'd love to hear your thoughts on what makes a supportive carer. What advice do you give to carers in terms of what they need to do to ensure that, as you put it, Ruby, children and young people don't just survive, they thrive? Ruby, would you like to start with any thoughts on that?
I have a lot to say about this. So when I was in my 3rd residential care home, I had the absolute privilege of having 3 amazing residential care workers. And honestly, if it wasn't for them, I do not know how I would be now. I actually still have contact with them because they saw me as a person and they were like, you are a human being, Ruby, and we're going to treat you like one. They were so welcoming, so understanding of my challenges. One of them, their son, niece and nephew went to the same school as me. So she actually gave me school uniforms from her son because DHS wouldn't buy me more. So she went above and beyond for me. She even tried to help me with my schooling because turns out I actually have ADHD, which didn't get diagnosed until after I left care. So she helped me and she tried to go above and beyond and make sure that I actually was learning and doing the best I can in school because she could see I was struggling. Another one of my carers actually nominated me for the 7 Years Young Achiever Award because she saw me as this amazing young person. And because I don't have contact with my mum, so because of these 3 workers, or 4 actually, because my beneficiary worker also was very supportive, but because of these workers, I felt less alone. I felt like I had female role models as someone who was living in a dominating residential care home. I was living with 3 other guys, so I didn't have very many female role models. And what was for them? Oh, I do not know how I would be today. And so my biggest thing is, don't treat young people like they're your job. If you're going to work in the system, they are not your job. They are like your children, and you need to understand that they just want to be cared for. They just want to be they want to feel like they're not alone. I still call up my old residential care workers to this day and be like, I just need to talk to someone. Can I talk to you? About a week ago, I was on the phone to one of them for 4 hours because I just needed to talk. And being able to have that, and a young person being in care and having someone to just talk to and just be like, hey, I'm not having a good time, or I'm not quite sure how I'm feeling. That's what young people need, because they so often feel like they can't talk about stuff because whatever they say gets written down, and they don't want their life to be documented. They want to live. And to have these workers and have workers like I did, I wish that we could multiply them almost and have them everywhere, because they were so impactful in my life and they supported me in ways that I didn't know I needed. And as a young person who was struggling with self-identity, figuring out the world, and I was angry at the world. So if it wasn't for them, I probably wouldn't have even gone to university, let alone get to where I am now. So that's my biggest key. Just be patient, and also just treat them like they're human.
Thanks, Ruby. That's so powerful. I mean, I think as a child or a young person who's struggling, you shouldn't have to know what to ask in order to get the help you need. Amelia, did you want to come in on what it is that makes a supportive carer?
Yeah, so I think one of the biggest things, both from what we've heard and I think reflecting on my experience, is communication, but also communication about difficult things. When say, as an example, our first placement broke down and communication of next steps and all that sort of stuff just didn't happen. And I think that kind of made the whole situation worse. And I know that we heard a lot in terms of, a lot of the time carers, due to all the stresses and everything, aren't able to maintain placements for a number of reasons. And for the children and young people in their care, sometimes they're the last to find out, or they never find out, why things broke down or kind of the reasons for things, and they might blame themselves, and that's more harmful. And I guess the key point that I'm trying to get to is communication is really important, even when it is a hard conversation to have. I know we want to try and be positive all the time, but sometimes you really do just have to be honest and open and transparent, because that's much less harmful than letting them fill in the blanks and potentially make the story worse than what it actually is in reality. So Yeah, that's a big one for me.
Yeah, I think we never have the hard conversations. We kind of never get to the solutions to the problems.
Exactly, yeah.
I'm conscious that we're getting towards the end of our time. We could talk for much, much longer. There are a few questions in the Q&A, and I don't think we're going to get to all of them. So forgive me, they're excellent questions, but I'm just going to pick and choose a little bit. Liana, there is a question. What is the interjurisdictional relational welfare practice examples that you think might be transferable from Victoria's systems and structures to help us act on Ruby's points about relationships and role models? Are there things that the rest of us can learn from Victoria?
Is that the question?
That's at the very bottom there, if you want to have.
Yeah, I think I'm going to, I suspect I'm not going to answer this in the way that was intended. I mean, we saw, I won't go into detail about particular practice models. And I'm probably not equipped. I'm sure there are people who can kind of say, okay, this particular practice model, this particular trauma-informed or trauma-responsive approach is preferable to the other. We didn't go into that in this work. What I would say, though, is that all of the schools that we saw who had consciously made a decision to take a trauma-informed approach in some way that had built capacity and awareness amongst staff, that had made sure that they were drawing on any funding available to have key people who could play particular kind of advisory roles as well as be key points of contact for children, irrespective of the practice model that they had applied or the type of training. And there's a couple of particular types of trauma training that clearly are very, very good, that schools find very beneficial. But irrespective of the type, what made the biggest difference was that schools at a leadership level had made a conscious decision that this was an important part of the way they would run the school and the way they would understand behaviours and the way they would respond to behaviours, and then went about trying to kind of pull in any of the flexible funding and training, etc., to try and make good on that. So really what I would say is, yes, there will be many, many different kind of sources of advice about the best kind of model, the best practice framework, etc. But Lordy, just the very fact that a school is trying to take that approach and not simply saying a student's not attending, okay, that's them, or a student is behaving badly, okay, that's it, we're going to suspend, or a student can't sit in class for more than an hour without getting disruptive, we're going to put them on a modified timetable until they can do better. Really, those are the responses we need to tackle, and a conscious mindset to change that is actually what's most key.
I think leadership can be incredibly important. There's one question in the chat that I think doesn't relate to Victoria, that uses New South Wales as the example, and I'll paraphrase a little bit on this question, that asks about the investigation of misconduct within the department, including teachers, principals, and so on. It raises the concern that sometimes police are notified, but the Office of the Child Guardian isn't. Liana, I wonder if you'd like to share with us, thoughts on how we ensure that children are kept safe within schools, and how any misconduct should be dealt with and reported.
Yeah, and I think that question is referencing the role that the Office of the Children's Guardian plays with reportable conduct, and of course we at the Children's Commission in Victoria also administer the reportable conduct scheme. So what I would say is, at the very worst ends of the spectrum of individual teachers or other adults in schools and the way they're responding to students in care, that might be significant neglect, if it is such a kind of breach of that adult's responsibility and professional responsibility, it might constitute significant neglect, or it might constitute behaviour that causes significant emotional, psychological harm. So it may be that it meets that threshold to be notified to the Commissioner or the OCG as a reportable allegation. And everyone who is interested in this space should inform themselves about what are the different types of reportable conduct, what does have to by law be reported through to the appropriate regulator, and then we oversee the investigation. What I would say is reportable conduct schemes are largely about identifying bad behaviour by individuals, bad, harmful, risky behaviour by individuals, and certainly there's crossover. A lot of what we've been talking about and what we saw in this inquiry is, yes, bad behaviour by individuals, but often because the system settings in which those individuals were working didn't support or require them to do anything differently. So yes, some of this will involve, okay, this individual has engaged in misconduct or reportable conduct and needs to be investigated separately. Yes, there should be then, and if you've got a question mark about whether an incident fits that, you should call OCG, call us, ask about it, and make sure that there's a chance to get that notified through to us. A lot of this, however, is requiring change at the school level, at the Department of Education level, at the care system level, at residential care home level, at care team meetings, case manager level. So our recommendations are predominantly about what are the different parts of the systems that need to change and need to be improved so that everyone in schools and elsewhere are behaving in the best way possible for children and young people.
We are almost at 2 o'clock, and so we're going to need to draw this conversation to a close. As I said, we could have talked for much longer. I really encourage everyone to read the report if you haven't already. It's a really important and powerful report, and you'll find the link in the chat. As we bring this conversation to a close, I'd love to hear what you would like to leave us as a final message, a final takeaway from this conversation. Liana, maybe we could begin with you.
We are a pretty well-resourced civilised society, or we like to think of ourselves as a civilised society. We generally do relatively well in terms of our education system compared to many, many parts of the globe. We are not doing well for children and young people in care. We are failing them, and we are failing them at such that it is entirely an exception down to the resources, the strength of the individual children and young people when they manage to get to the end of school and indeed beyond. We've got to change it. Anything that those on the webinar can do to agitate for that, I will be very grateful.
Thank you, Liana. Amelia, is there a message that you'd like to leave us with? Yeah,
I think something that is very clear both through the report and just like how we work here is just remembering that like children, young people, especially with the care system, are the ones that know it and should inform like how the system works and how it can be more effective, because we know that it's broken. And the only way to fix it is to talk to people that have lived it and know what it's like, rather than people that might do research, but it's a different level of understanding, I think, that's really important to consider. And so meaningfully doing that moving forward would be a massive improvement in the whole thing.
Yeah, so incredibly important. Thanks, Amelia. Ruby, would you like to give us a final message to take away from the conversation today?
Yeah, like I said before, children and young people are the present and the future. So being able to have their views and give them a space for them to stand up for themselves and those around them, because at the end of the day, like I think the past 6 years, 7 years that I've been advocating, I've been inspired by those around me, and it's made me a stronger person. So giving a space for young people to stand up for themselves and to stand up for others is what's going to make the system better, because those that have lived it are those that are going to change it. And that's what I think. Yeah.
It's a great message to finish on. Thank you, all three of you, for joining us today. Thank you for the report. Thank you for the work that you do. All three of you are incredibly inspiring, and I think if we are prepared to listen, have the ideas to lead us towards the change that we need to make. So thank you so much. Just a reminder to everyone that's joined us that this webinar will be available on our website, and please watch our website for details of the rest of the In Conversation with Children's Commissioners that we're going to be doing this year. Our next conversation is next month on the 30th of October, and that's going to be with the National Children's Commissioner, Anne Hollands, to talk about child justice in Australia. So please do join us again then. But once again, thank you so much, Liana, Amelia and Ruby, for joining us today, for sharing your expertise, your insights, your wisdom. And thank you to everyone else who joined us online. We hope to see you again for our next conversation. Thanks, everyone. Take care.